Welcome to the Authority File, the podcast that features conversations about the life cycle of scholarly communication. I'm Bill Mickey, your host and the editorial director at Choice. In this series, we're going to be talking about comic studies, grief, memory, and how all that can be combined into a pretty special piece of creative nonfiction. Joining me on this 4-episode series, which is brought to you with generous support from the Wilfrid Laurier University Press, is Dr. Dale Jacobs, a professor of English at the University of Windsor in Windsor, Ontario, and the author of several books, including his latest, On Comics and Grief. The title is a hybrid of scholarship, memoir, nostalgia, and grief over the recent death of the author's mother. It's an encapsulation of how researchers are allowing personal experiences to inform their scholarship and guide the ways in which it is presented. In this first episode, we're introduced to Dale and get the 10,000-foot take on what comic book studies is all about and what influenced his research on his book. Okay, hi Dale, welcome to the program.
Hi, Bill.
All right, let's start with a little bit about yourself. Can you just explain who you are, what you do, and a little bit about your research?
So, as you'll see from the book, I grew up in a small town in Alberta, and I did my first 2 degrees at the University of Alberta, and BAs in political science, and my MA is in English Lit. And then I went to Nebraska for my PhD, and that's in composition and rhetoric, so teaching of writing. That's been my career. So I was doing a lot of work initially on pedagogy and on literacy and the teaching of writing, and that was the sort of the first part of my career. I did work on Miles Horton and some of the um, education for social change and that kind of work. And then I came to when my first job was in North Carolina, and then I came to Windsor in 2000.
Mhm.
And sort of early on, maybe 2003, 2004, I was teaching a writing class, and some of the students said, "Do you read comics?" And I had as a kid, but I hadn't really for a good 15 years by that point. And they started giving me comics to read. So I was reading, and I started to think about how this fit into literacy. And at about the same time, I was starting to get interested in multimodal literacy, in the literacy that goes beyond just words.
Mhm.
That we'll get into that, I'm sure, more, but that includes images and sounds, etc. So I started to think about ways in which I could approach comics, and so it was through my own background in composition and rhetoric that I started to get into comics, and I first started to write about them in about 2005.
Mhm.
So I was initially interested in literacy and really in how comics work. That's one of the major things I'm always interested in. How do things work?
Right.
So the part was kind of the formalist side of comics. How do they work? How do people read them? How do people interact with them? And then I got into how do they sponsor people's literacy? In what ways are readers enmeshed in that? Not just giving money to publishers, but also I was interested in religious comics and the way they're used to kind of promote a specific kind of worldview,
Mhm.
those kinds of issues. So that's been a lot of my career in writing about comics.
Yep.
And then because I've always been interested in writing and teaching writing, I was starting to write creative nonfiction. I had a book that I co-wrote with my wife, Heidi Jacobs, called 100 Miles of Baseball, that came out in 2021. So I was moving towards doing that. And at the same time, interested with comics in the interdisciplinarity of the field. And then this project had always been on the back burner.
Mhm.
And at some point, I figured out really I wanted to write both creative nonfiction and about comics, and so this project came about. It came about for a number of reasons, but it really is, on Comics and Grief, is this synthesis of a lot of my past history of thinking about writing and wanting to write nonfiction and thinking about comics in a variety of kinds of ways, and all of that converging with my mother's death and the way it affected me. So I think that's how I kind of got to this particular book.
Right. So that seems to be where the creative nonfiction element comes into play. I mean, can you just real quick just kind of situate for us what creative nonfiction is?
So, creative nonfiction is nonfiction that uses techniques from fiction in order to get ideas across. It uses dialogue, it uses scenes, it uses characterization.
Hmm.
Um, it's nonfiction, but it's trying to write it in a way that will engage the reader as much as possible.
Right. Okay. And then, if you could, I mean, you've done this a little bit just now, but just generally define, comic book scholarship for us. What does that entail? And what different disciplines does that pull in?
Yeah, it's a big tent.
Yeah.
And I've really been interested in the formal side, how comics work, what I call comics theory. One of the things I teach most often is comics theory.
Hmm.
But also, people are interested in the history of comics, in particular artists. I think we almost get an overabundance of that. Looking at particular creators, especially cartoonists who both write and draw.
Mm.
And so I think a lot of that stems from the number of people who come from English studies, and that's just a normal transition, looking at particular creators. So we get thematic and close readings, but you also get people from, say, history, looking at how history gets represented in comics and historiography. You get people, graphic medicine is a big thing in comics. So people looking at how comics can be used to teach about health, but also memoirs of disability,
Mm.
ways in which health and comics can sort of interact. So
Hmm.
there's a lot of people in the health fields interested. Librarians, actually, a lot of librarians in graphic medicine. But you get people from political science, art history, media studies. And in this book, I draw quite a bit from media studies because there's that interest in the production, the conditions of production,
Hmm.
and also in reception, which I'm very interested in. There's a lot of people who work in that fandom, for example.
Right.
Um, so yeah, it's a very big tent. There's a lot of ways to approach.
Just uh, kind of a little detail question here, but do graphic novels fall into the comics scholarship field, or are those typically kept separate?
No, I think most of us just use comics to talk about the medium as a whole,
Yeah.
and
Okay.
graphic novels is, we have floppy magazine style comics, we have graphic novels, we have web comics. Those are all
Yeah.
just forms of comics.
Okay. Got it. So your book is called On Comics and Grief, and yeah, I'm curious how like the interdisciplinary nature you just described of comic studies influenced your approach to your book.
I, I knew for a long time that I wanted this book to really bring in the interdisciplinary aspect. The first book I wrote on comics in 2013, which was called Graphic Encounters, was about multimodal literacy sponsorship. So it was, I brought in some aspects of other disciplines, but it really was from the perspective of what I know from comp ret.
Yeah.
Um, but increasingly, that's more than 10 years ago, and I've become more and more interested in other approaches, in other disciplines, ways of seeing comic studies. But we talk about ourselves as interdisciplinary, but often that just means that people are coming from their own discipline.
Hmm.
and writing about comics instead of combining methodologies. And that's hard to
Yeah.
do. It's really hard to do because it's so, and I find myself doing this too, it's easy to default to what you know. So that's why I think media studies comes in, but more than that, book history comes in as a way to think through this, because book history looks at books or comics in this case as texts, as objects, and as sites of transaction. So, you get as text, that's the English studies way. You look at them, the material inside it, the story that's being told. But then if you look at them as objects, you start to think about materiality and production and sites of transaction. You can think about the way they're embedded in a commercial transaction that happens all the time. I say to my students, these are objects of art, but they're also objects of commerce.
Right.
And we have to think. So I think book history was a way to bring a lot of different aspects of how people study comics into the fold at once. And I've been working on this project sort of off and on for a long time, for 10 years. And that was always in the back of my mind, that it needed to be interdisciplinary, but it wasn't until a few years ago that it came into focus that it needed also to be something more than that.
Hmm. Excellent. So the book, one of the many interesting qualities about the book is that it focuses solely on 1976 as the publication year for the comics you examined. Um, why did you pick this year, and how does it stand out from, say, like the periods or styles that scholars are more likely to study?
Yeah, I think I picked 1976. Well, originally this was a side project as I was finishing the first book. I
Mm,
just needed something to think about other than that book.
right.
So initially it was just I was going to read all the Marvel stuff from 1976 just because it was nostalgia really that
Yeah.
started it. I was going to read that material. And then as I read it, I started to see that the Marvel was doing something interesting with the bicentennial. And it started to dawn on me that maybe there's something interesting if I look at all of the companies that are working that year. Partly it's because 1976 is just a typical year. Too often we look at the exceptional in comics. We look at the brilliant cartoonists, and I get that.
Yeah.
I've done that. We want to do that. But I'm interested in looking, what does a typical year look like? What are people actually reading, and how can we study them? How can we think about the readers and the people producing the comics and what's in the comics, all the book history, different perspectives? How can we look at them as texts and objects and sites of transaction? Uh, I think a little bit was Bart Beatty's book, 10 Cent Archie, which took Archie comics seriously from the 60s. Those comics that people don't normally study. And I sort of wanted to take that even farther, and let's look at all the comics from one year, the ones that are great and the ones that are not great, and just look at everything that's happening in that year. But the other thing with 76, as I got into it, I realized that the comic publishers were actually in a lot of trouble,
Mm,
because in the early 70s and towards the mid 70s, sales and readership dropped off pretty precipitously. In 60, 68, 69, they're still very healthy. By the time we get to 76, they're in trouble. And so I was interested in what the companies were doing to try to gain readership, to turn that around. I was interested in what kinds of comics in terms of genres were being published, because we always think, oh, what comics were published in 76? And normally people think, well, it's all superheroes, but that's not true. We have basically every genre of comics still being published. So I was in. It's typical, but it's also this interesting sort of cusp year of the industry being in trouble. So to me, it was something that had been understudied,
Hmm.
And so I was interested, it could have been 75, it could have been 78 initially, but 76 was the year I picked. And as I thought about it more, it was also when I was 10. And, there's that nostalgic factor. But then as I started to think about mom, it's also when mom's still alive.
Right.
And that's, as I thought more, that started to move me towards the book it finally ended up becoming.
You just heard from Dr. Dale Jacobs, an English professor at the University of Windsor and author of the recent book on comics and grief. This episode was brought to you with support from Wilfrid Laurier University Press. Join us next week when Dale and I take a deeper dive into comic studies and some of the main findings of his book. As always, underwriting opportunities for the Authority File podcast are directed by Choice's advertising director, Pam Marino, and all of our episodes are produced and edited by Choice's digital media producer, Sabrina Kofer, with support from digital media assistant Ashley Roy. That's all for this week. Thanks for joining us.